So you guys got my email. Thank you for showing up on time. We'll see. It may take the others a little while to catch up. We'll see. Depends if they read their email, right? Well, that's only 11 of you. Hopefully the others will show up. I do have to take attendance, and that does get reported now. So they've just been sending out emails about that today. So let's see. Ben Davis is here. Good. A couple announcements before we jump into the lecture. It will just be a lecture today. Remember, you've got that discussion thread that's due no later than Friday at midnight. And you just hit the discussion button in Blackboard for that. Thursday, there's a quiz on this week's readings and, in fact, the lectures as well. And, of course, I will be posting this PowerPoint to Blackboard. Actually, I already have, so you can find that there. So I think we're pretty squared away in that regard. We're still a couple people short. We'll just have to let them figure that out, and hopefully they show up so I don't have to ping them later on. All right, so let's go on over to the PowerPoint and begin our discussion today, which is really about how other European powers respond to Spain and Portugal's rise and their claim to actually own the oceans with that mare clausam idea. And this will be mightily contested in a couple of different ways. So let's get into that a little bit. So Spain and Portugal basically get ahead of everybody else in the exploration game, and they set up empires before other people, and that will benefit them economically and politically and in all sorts of other ways. And of course, this is going to make other European powers jealous, sorry. And they will, of course, constantly challenge this idea of mare clausam by sending their ships into waters that Spain and Portugal claim to rule. And what they're not doing, though, is sending their navies around the world to challenge the Spanish and Portuguese empires, because that's really not how navies worked back then. And there really isn't what we would call a navy today. So what they're doing is encouraging pirates who don't really need that much encouragement considering how much gold and silver and other wealth the Spanish and Portuguese are shipping back to Europe. And what else are they doing? So they're sort of encouraging those pirates and hold on a second. Carol. Good. And they're also sending in privateers who are sort of licensed pirates. And finally, they're actually going to use these big companies, private companies with stock shares and all that, to attack other empires. And this is not direct warfare. Nobody's trying to directly challenge the Spanish and the Portuguese, usually. There's some exceptions to that. Instead, this should be considered what is called today gray zone warfare, where you're trying to antagonize another power, you're trying to grab little bits of land, you're trying to chisel off bits of wealth, but what you're trying not to do is to declare war on another power because you don't want to go to war. Wars are expensive. Spain especially is rich. You don't want to antagonize them any more than you have to. So, you know, you're trying not to go to war is the short answer. Does anybody have any questions about that idea? Okay, then I'll just keep on moving on. So two patterns evolve. Mostly it's going to be pirates in the West Indies, that is to say the Caribbean, harassing the Spanish Empire and all that gold and silver that's moving around from the Americas to Europe. And then in the East Indies, you've got these big chartered companies challenging the Portuguese and their control on Asian goods like spices, tea, silk, all the good stuff that Europeans want out of the Far East. What will emerge out of this sort of complex milieu, right? It's complicated. I'm talking about 150 years today, basically from 1500 to about 1650 or so, is that the other European powers come up with a new paradigm to challenge mare clausam, and it's called mare liberum, that is freedom of the seas. And that's going to be very important for our purposes because it's a value that the United States will buy into immediately. Even before the Declaration of Independence, we buy into this idea of mare liberum, and it is something that the US Navy defends to this day, because this gray zone warfare is enduring into the 21st century. And right now, that's really what the Chinese are doing with all the games they're playing in the South China Sea, occupying islands, using these little blue men, as they're called, these maritime militias. So this is actually a very old idea. There's nothing new under the sun. So there you have it. All right, so let's move on to gray zone warfare. I think this is a pretty good definition that helps you get a handle on what's going on there. You know, it's this idea it's neither war nor peace, but there certainly are aggressors, and they are certainly trying to get chunks of stuff they want, whether it's land or wealth or power or whatnot. and they're using what, this ambiguity and leverage, right? There's a lot of uh, what do you call it? Plausible deniability. Oh no, I didn't tell that person to go do that. It had nothing to do with me. When in fact, you might have been encouraging that person to do exactly that thing off the record, right? So it's sneaky stuff. So why this method? It's because these other European countries fear the wealth of Spain. Spain militarily is very strong, so they're trying to antagonize Spain to a certain extent, but what they're trying not to do is actually go to war with Spain. With some luck. Okay. Uh, a lot of this action will occur in the West Indies. And here you see a map of the West Indies, and basically what this shows is that there are these choke points. So once a year, Spain sends a fleet with supplies to the New World. And it goes to the New World, then it splits up. Some of it goes to South America, others go to Mexico, and then they reconvene at Havana, gather together as a fleet, sail right by Florida, and go back to Spain. So there's some choke points here, right? You don't really care so much if you're attacking the Spanish about their approach. You want to hit the Spanish fleet on its way back to Spain, because that's when it's loaded with gold and silver. And the obvious choke point here is just off Florida. Okay, so choke points. Oh, there's our Mahanian component for today. Florida is crucial, and it's why French pirates will set up a base on what's now coastal Georgia to attack these treasure fleets headed back to Europe. The Spanish will wipe out that settlement and will set up their own base at St. Augustine to sort of guard those approaches, that choke point. So it's strategically some pretty good thinking going on there. Okay, so I'm still not seeing Evan here, Evan Zverev. Anybody have any word from him? I know he's had some technology problems, but okay. Let's go on to the next slide. All right. So, oh, that sounds like somebody just arrived. So let me check for a second, because they are asking me to do that. No, not seeing him still. Okay. Oops. All right. French pirates. Oops, we're still on English pirates. French pirates are really the first to attack the Spanish Empire. And that starts as early as 1523, where this guy, Jean Florin, seizes a Spanish treasure ship off Portugal, right? Very close to Spain. It's almost all the way back home. And then this French pirate grabs it. Notably, this ship was full of treasure from Mexico. This is a ship loaded with treasure that Hernan Cortez had taken from the Aztec Empire. And they are, all this loot is loaded onto ships and sent back to Spain. And in one of these ships does actually get captured by the French, makes the Spanish very angry. But the French say, we don't even know who this guy is, although they appreciate the fact that he's brought a lot of gold and silver into the country. The French continue to be the #1 attackers of this Spanish Empire, 1544, you get this guy whose name I like a lot, Jean de Bois, or Pegleg, who raids coastal communities in Cuba. And in fact, they are even doing things like sacking cities in South America, Cartagena. And the Spanish pushed back, and that's when in 1565 they wipe out this French settlement. Oh, I guess it was in Florida, not in Georgia. Uh, and Huguenots are French Protestants who tended to be the #1 pirates attacking the Spanish because the Spanish were Catholic. Catholics, Protestants don't get along. And so there is a religious element here that makes things even more bitter. Okay. English pirates are pretty fierce too, and the Spanish actually refer to England as a nation of pirates. Okay, and you get guys like Francis Drake, referred to as El Draco by the Spanish, who launches very audacious raids in Central America. For example, in 1573, he actually has a land party operating in Panama, where you get silver that had been mined on the Pacific coast of South America, all gets funneled up to the Pacific coast of Panama. Then a mule train would carry it across to the Caribbean coast. And he will actually go into the jungle and intercept these mule trains. It's not long after that he circumnavigates the world to try and plunder Spanish trade in the Pacific. He wants to capture that Manila galleon we talked about the other day. And in fact, he does in 1579 capture a treasure ship in the Pacific, a heavily armed ship referred to as the Cacafuego. And that literally means ship fire, because it is such a heavily armed vessel. It's got cannons everywhere. It's a real brute. But in his very fast and very good ship called the Golden Hind, he's able to capture this, and it's a fortune. And he brings that back to England, and the English Queen Elizabeth, is very happy with him. Tells doesn't tell the Spanish ambassador that, who's trying to figure out what's going on. There's all this Spanish silver and gold in London all of a sudden, and eventually these English pirates will lead to a war a formal war with war fleets between Spain and England, and that's usually known as the Spanish Armada of 1588. And the Spanish king attempts to conquer England, puts together an enormous fleet. It takes years to do it. He will notably fail. The British have all these pirates who become naval officers and their ships. England does have a navy, but here in Mahanian terms is where things get a little weird. Navies in the late 1500s are seen as defensive forces. They operate in your own coastline. You don't send your navy to the Pacific or even across the Atlantic. They stick very close to home. So these pirates combine with the English Navy. You've got these very aggressive English captains. You've got very good English cannon that is much better than Spanish cannons. Spanish cannons tend to be field artillery that is lashed in place on the deck of a ship. It's really not very effective. And so between the aggressive English captains and the British gunnery and stormy weather, the Spanish Armada does not fare well. They lose like 50 ships, a few stagger back to Spain, but it's an enormous failure, and Spain spent a lot of money and a lot of effort for nothing in the end. So it's not a great situation for the Spanish. After the Spanish Armada, there's a special group of pirates called Buccaneers. Buccaneers operate after 1605, and they're very international. You get English and French and Dutch and other odds and ends showing up in these Buccaneer fleets, and they operate whole fleets, very often operating out of island bases in the West Indies or the Caribbean, and they will do things like attack cities. Panama City in Panama amongst them. So who's going to tell me who on what ocean is Panama City? Just tell me in chat.
The Pacific.
It's on the Pacific, right? And the Buccaneer admiral who does this is a guy named Harry Morgan, sometimes known as Captain Morgan. Yes, there is a rum named after this guy. And he actually lands a fleet on the Caribbean coast of Panama, marches across, and attacks and seizes Panama City, which ends up being so devastated by his attack and mostly burnt down that the Spanish actually abandoned that site, and they moved the whole city to a more defensible site on the other side of Panama Bay. So there's just a few ruins of the original Panama City left. If you ever go through the Panama Canal, you might be able to see them. These guys can be pretty effective, and they really annoy the Spanish, who have difficulty fighting them off. So there is certainly a certain form of sea power working here, but again, it's without formal navies. Even Spain does not have a permanent navy until after they're defeated in the Spanish Armada. And then they begin to rethink things and try and figure out a different way to do it. So, okay, let's go back to the slideshow. Okay. So, Buccaneers were a big deal and very powerful. To switch gears on you here, there was another way for countries to attack Spain and Portugal, and it was by creating companies that basically attacked Spanish and Portuguese ships very often. Not always, but usually. And they're licensed by the government, the state, to trade overseas, and these charters or licenses empower them to defend themselves. So they've got big, powerful armed ships, often referred to as Indiamen, and while they have lots of cannon, they also have cargo holds. So they're a very powerfully armed cargo ship. And mostly these companies, the most powerful of them, trade with Asia, but you do get other companies like the Dutch West India Company, which is the Dutch company that actually founds New York as New Amsterdam. So now we're getting into some American history here. This company does something amazing in 1628. They captured the entire Spanish treasure fleet for that year. They brought the money back to the Netherlands. It basically wiped out the national debt. It all got paid off. And the stockholders became very rich. They got huge dividends from this company attacking the Spanish treasure fleet. And, and when the Spanish complained to the Dutch government, the Dutch say, well, we don't care. We're rich now, and you're not. And the Spanish now are having a fiscal crisis because they don't have the silver that they anticipated showing up that year. So really some very interesting things start happening with these chartered companies. Now, you've heard of at least one of these companies, the British East India Company, also known as John Company or the EIC, was created in 1600 to trade with India. And eventually, this company is going to rule all of what is now Pakistan, India, Sri Lanka, and Bangladesh, which I managed to misspell there. Thank you very much. And they rule it as one entity, which they call India. These are the guys who carry a lot of tea. Why do they do that? Well, because part of their charter is the government gave them a monopoly to cover this tea. And again, to get back to American history briefly, yeah, this is the company that the Boston Tea Party was involved with, right? When those colonists threw that tea in the ocean. Also, you probably know the East India Company because I think that they're the bad guys in that Pirates of the Caribbean franchise, right? And it really was this big, very, very big, very, very powerful company with armies and fleets and a whole government, governed all of India. And one of the interesting things about the British East India Company in terms of sea power is that the Indian Navy of today sees itself as evolving out of the British East India Company. It may be, certainly to my knowledge, the only Navy in the world that actually comes out of a chartered company like this. Certainly very different from the US Navy, which is always a government entity, right? But the Indian Navy, which is, it's not a hugely powerful Navy these days, but it is a rising Navy and a fairly important partner for the US these days. Interesting that it sees its ancestor as a company. Okay. Besides the British, the Dutch have another company, this time the East India Company. This is not the company that captured that whole Spanish silver fleet. This is one that operates in Southeast Asia and is aimed mostly at fighting the Portuguese. Often referred to as the VOC after its Dutch initials. The Dutch language almost impossible for English speakers to pronounce, so they just say VOC. Founded almost the same time as the English East India Company, 2 years later, 1602, sends big trading fleets to Southeast Asia, and it's really trying to intercept that Portuguese monopoly on the spice trade and take it over for itself, and it will start founding bases in Indonesia. Modern Jakarta is founded initially as a Portuguese base for the Dutch East India Company. And this company is not only big and powerful, and it makes the Netherlands very, very wealthy, but it's also important because it fundamentally changes how the West looks at the oceans. And what I mean by that is there's this incident where Dutch VOC ships capture a Portuguese carrack, or a big cargo carrier, the Santa Catarina, and they captured off Singapore. And Singapore is, of course, one of those classic choke points, right? Certainly remains so in the 21st century. And the Portuguese are outraged. They say, you can't do that. You can't take that ship because that's our ocean because of mare clausam. You Dutch aren't supposed to be there, so give the ship back. The Dutch formulate a legal argument by this very young jurist or lawyer, a guy by the name of Hugo Grotius. Grotius, Grotius, rejects the mare clausam idea and says that by natural law, everybody should be able to sail anywhere they want. Nobody owns an ocean. There is no such thing as mare clausam. Instead, there is mare liberum. Everybody gets to sail wherever they want. And eventually, that will become the Western standard. And even the Portuguese and the Spanish will give up the idea of mare clausam. The Spanish, notably in 1790, finally give up that idea that they own the entire Pacific Ocean. Now, why this is sort of interesting is that mare clausam seems to be coming back with the Chinese in the South China Sea and seizing those little islands. Not only are they engaging in that gray zone warfare model, but they also are trying to say, hey, we own this water and nobody else can cross it without our permission. And how does the US Navy respond to that? You can either unmute or type it out in chat. What's the US Navy doing in the South China Sea these days?
Power projection.
Not exactly. Joe Klein came up with the exact phrase, freedom of navigation operations, right? And so U.S. Navy ships, sometimes are allies, but pretty much just us, every once in a while will sail through quite close to those islands just to let the Chinese know, you know what, we don't believe your claims. They're baloney in international law. We know that. And just to remind the Chinese, they will sail through. And this, of course, infuriates the Chinese, but their claims really are pretty ridiculous. So there you have it. So, okay, let me get back to... get back to that slideshow. Okay. Yep. Why are we up there? Okay, the Santa Catarina. This is in 1603, and there's the whole deal. And so to wrap up the formal lecture part of this, you know, this is a period where the Iberian idea of mare clausam is contested by other Europeans. Now, there are other peoples contesting that too, like the Turkish Empire, but that's more of a formal war type situation, and both the Portuguese and the Spanish do just fine against the Turks. And what we are talking about, again, that idea of the gray zone conflict, right? You poke the bear with a stick again and again and again, and eventually they're going to react. And that's what the Spanish Armada is. But the Spanish Armada really can't beat the English, so that doesn't work. The gray zone warfare takes the form mostly of pirates in the West Indies and chartered companies, mostly in the East Indies, although there is that Dutch company that does take that Spanish treasure fleet that does pretty amazing things. So this is the period where mare liberum develops. It's the paradigm you all will be working with, unless the Chinese take over the world or something like that. And curiously, in terms of sea power, very little in the way of navies operating in this period. And also, in Mahanian terms, it's sort of curious because the navies play such a minor role. It's almost like sea power without navies, or navies only play this very limited defensive role, which is very un-Mahan. He really thought navies were offensive forces, right? To go out and seek the enemy out, not to defend your shoreline. So the whole Mahanian paradigm not working for us yet. but you can see things are developing, right? These globally, these choke points like Singapore, so crucial in the world today, are even then very important. Or Florida is a choke point for ships leaving the Caribbean, and becomes valuable pretty much just because of that. Not a lot of colonization going on, especially in southern Florida. All right. Does anybody else have questions for me? Have you been able to get into the reading? You can either send me a chat or it's okay to say no, but you better get into it pretty quick for that quiz. Again, that quiz will be on Blackboard. It will be open note. Anything I gave you, that PowerPoint slide, this PowerPoint slide, the reading, it's open notes, and hopefully it'll be better constructed than the first one. I'm learning on the fly, just like you guys as well. Any questions or concerns about the other assignments, the threads, or attendance stuff, or the gradebook, or anything like that? Oh, you're a tight-lipped group. All righty, folks. If you do have questions, feel free to email me, and I'll be glad to address them. It looks like that's what I have to say for today. I thought after yesterday's lecture was too long, I'd give you a shorter lecture, although I assure you I could tell pirate stories all day long. That's kind of fun stuff with Captain Morgan and Drake, attacking the Spanish. There's good stuff. Okay, I do have a meaningful question. Do you want us to send a message in the chat for attendance at the start of class? I think I have everybody who attended. There's only one of you who isn't here. So yes, I may end up doing that. I have done that in some of our other classes. It's not a bad idea, Hudson, and we'll try to keep that up. So what does the carrot mean, Lucas? That little symbol you sent.
They're kind of like, it kind of like emphasizes, like points at the question above.
Ah, okay, gotcha. Okay, good. I suspect that's a generational difference. We communicate a little bit differently. Hey, I'm not here to burn up your time. Go read, do whatever you can. I hope all of you are weathering this storm, both physically and mentally. And we will have a brief Zoom discussion before the quiz, just like we did last week, okay?
Thanks, sir.
Take care.
Thank you, sir.
You too, sir. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.
You're welcome.